Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we're taking a slow walk through history's filth. It's not a story of progress. It's a long, fragrant reminder that the past was never spotless. From the caves of Paleolithic times to the slums of Victorian London, these are the filthiest eras in human history. Before we start, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you'd prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair plus other sleep tools in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. From the moment humans learned to stand upright, they have been trying to rise above their own smell. Every age, no matter how advanced, has declared itself clean, proudly, loudly, and always too soon. Cleanliness has never been a state of being. It is a performance, a brief illusion, maintained against the overwhelming persistence of dirt. Even now, our admiration for the past is filtered through a strange amnesia. We picture marble temples gleaming white, cathedrals smelling faintly of incense, and palaces filled with fresh-cut flowers. What we forget is the reality that never made it into art, the smell of bodies packed close, the rot of meat and leather, the slow, sweet tang of standing water. The truth is that filth has always been a companion, a constant presence, pressing against the thin walls of human order. It is the oldest part of civilization and the one thing it never quite learns to leave behind. To understand just how deep our roots go, we have to start before the word clean even existed, in the damp dark of prehistory. Before there were cities, there were fires, not the tidy hearths of civilization, but open flames that spat smoke into low ceilings and painted everything black. The air inside a cave was a living thing, thick, heavy, clinging to hair and skin. When people moved, the soot rose in soft clouds, drifting through the dim orange light, like ghosts of every meal ever burned. They coughed, wiped their noses, and went on living. There was no such thing as dirt because there was no concept of clean. The earth was simply what everything was made from. The ground they walked on, the dust that clung to their legs, the taste in their mouths. Smoke meant warmth, warmth meant life, and life had a smell all its own. Their world was small and immediate. A skin scraped from a deer, left unwashed, became a blanket and a home for fleas. Meat cooked over a smoky fire filled the air with sweetness that turned rancid by morning. The smell of decay never vanished, it only changed shape. When wounds opened, they pressed them with clay or wrapped them in moss. Mud was a balm, not a threat. The line between healing and infection hadn't yet been drawn, and so every cure was also a contamination. A hunter returned from the forest covered in sweat and blood, and his family welcomed him that way. To smell of life was to smell of survival. There were no mirrors to show them the film of grease that gathered on their faces. Rivers were shared spaces, watering holes for beasts and humans alike. The animals that fed them were the same ones that fouled the water, and still the people drank. There was no choice. In the evenings they squatted by the same banks, rinsing their hands in water that had seen every sort of use. They didn't call it filth. It was simply the world, unchanged and unjudged. Their bodies adapted to it. Hair grew thick to catch insects. Skin toughened against the cold and the bite of flies. They slept on hides that still smelled of the forest, with smoke in their lungs and lice on their scalps. And yet, there was no shame in it. The words for disgust and impurity did not exist. The only thing that mattered was endurance, the quiet ability to wake up again and keep breathing the same air. Even their gods, when they began to imagine them, were carved from the same clay they squatted upon. Creation itself was an act of dirt. Fire, though vital, was also corrosive. Everything near it blackened. The walls, the ceiling, their skin. A cave used for years would shine like polished coal. The soot burned into its bones. When a storm blew in and the smoke couldn't escape, their eyes watered until they saw nothing but shapes. Children grew up with lungs lined by ash and learned to call it home. And still, that choking haze was safer than the cold outside. They lived encased in their own residue, the smell of wood smoke, of meat, of wet hair. It was the first perfume of humanity, honest and unpretending. The notion of cleansing came only through pain. When rain fell, it washed the soot from their skin and left them shivering. When a river flooded, it tore through camps, sweeping away the debris of daily life. They learned to associate water with danger, with cold, with drowning, with loss. The idea of bathing for its own sake would have made no sense. Water belonged to the world of animals, a thing to drink or cross. Not to use in ritual, to submerge oneself in it willingly was to invite death. Only later, when fire and shelter made comfort possible, would humanity begin to mistake cleanliness for virtue. Inside their shelters, the smells of life mixed freely. Smoke, fat, sweat, rot. The odour of death was always near. They lived beside their refuse, among bones gnawed smooth by dogs and tools worn down to splinters. The wind carried everything away eventually, and so the cycle continued. If a body fell, it was buried shallow or left for scavengers. Decay was part of the landscape, not an interruption. They understood it instinctively. What rotted returned, what burned was gone. Theirs was a world without disinfectant, but also without denial. Night brought new scents, damp earth cooling under the stars, the musk of animal hides, the faint sweetness of sap from burning branches, the sound of rain on stone mixed with the crackle of fire, and the sigh of sleeping bodies. It was not a clean world, but it was consistent. They never had to wonder if they were pure. There was no higher standard against which to measure themselves, no priest or physician to say otherwise. Their bodies bore the world's memory, the scars, the dirt, the smoke, the taste of salt and iron. If someone grew sick, the cause was invisible, but not mysterious. It was the will of the world, not a punishment for uncleanness. The sick were tended by touch, by herbs gathered from the same soil that bred disease. There was no division between medicine and contamination, only a fragile balance that might tip either way. The ones who survived passed on their strength, their parasites, and their ignorance. The ones who didn't became part of the landscape again. Their bones ground into the same dust that coated every living face. In time, the fires moved from caves to open plains, then back again as the ice returned. People followed herds, carried their soot with them, left behind rings of ash that future generations would mistake for hearths of civilization. They had no sense of the word filthy, no impulse to separate the clean from the unclean. To live was to be covered in the world's residue. There was no shame in it because there was no alternative. The first humans did not rise above the dirt, they rose because of it. And so they endured, smelling of smoke and flesh and rain. Their hands hardened, their lungs darkened, their teeth wore down against grit. When they dreamed of gods, those gods were not spotless. They were carved from mud, clothed in furs and breathed the same sour air. They survived not by conquering filth, but by accepting it, by understanding that in a world untouched by soap or ceremony, dirt was not corruption, it was continuity. They did not need to be clean because nothing around them was. The rivers, the wind, the animals, and the earth itself shared the same grime. In that balance lay their peace, a kind of harmony lost as soon as the first walls went up and the first hearths were enclosed. The moment people began to gather, to build, to separate what was inside from what was out there, the old innocence of dirt began to fade. The first cities of Mesopotamia rose from floodplains that were fertile but fickle, swelling with life one season and reeking of decay the next. The people of Ur and Babylon carved their homes from the same riverbanks that rotted their food. Every wall, every street, every temple was an attempt to stand a little taller than the mud that birthed it. Yet the mud always won. Beneath the proud facades of civilization, the earth remained damp and foul, a reminder that progress has always been built on what it pretends to bury. For the first time, humans could no longer walk away from their waste. In the wild, what was left behind was reclaimed by wind and rain. But in a city of thousands, the filth stayed, collecting in corners, seeping into the alleys, drying to dust that rose again with every footstep. The inhabitants learned to dig channels through the streets, guiding the runoff away from their doorways and into the nearest river. Clay pipes followed, carefully fired and stacked beneath the paving stones, carrying what no one wished to see into the same waters that kept them alive. Civilization's first sewer was also its first confession, that the act of living together required a place for everything unwanted to go. The smell, however, had no respect for invention. The Tigris and Euphrates were broad and brown, their surfaces glimmering with oil from kitchens and the soft sheen of decay. When the current slowed, the waste settled in sluggish eddies, feeding reeds and mosquitoes. The people washed their clothes in that same water, prayed beside it, and poured libations of wine and milk that mixed with sewage on the river's skin. To live by a river was to depend on it completely and to poison it daily. Yet for all the filth, these cities considered themselves miracles of order. They had writing, trade, and temples. Surely the gods could forgive a little stench. Cleanliness became less a physical state and more a spiritual one. Priests instructed citizens to wash before entering temples, to rinse their mouths before speaking holy names, to cleanse their hands of both dust and guilt. Ritual purity mattered more than practical hygiene. Water, handled correctly, could make a man acceptable to the divine, even if it couldn't make him safe. A merchant might scrub his fingers before sacrificing at a shrine, then walk barefoot through a street running with refuse. A priest might bathe in sacred water at dawn, then officiate over a festival while the gutters overflowed outside. The difference between clean and unclean was not chemical but moral. If the prayers were right, the gods would not notice the smell. In the crowded quarters of clay jars of waste were emptied into pits dug beneath the streets. The cesspits were lined with reeds, meant to absorb the liquid and leave the solids to dry. When they filled, workers covered them with earth and dug another. The result was a layered city, one part living, one part decomposing, one part waiting to be forgotten. Archaeologists, centuries later, would marvel at the sophistication of Mesopotamian plumbing. The citizens themselves likely marvelled at the smell. Even the most careful brickwork could not contain it. The odour rose through cracks, curling into homes where ovens baked bread and lamps burned oil. To live in the first cities was to breathe both progress and decay with every inhalation. The marketplace was a theatre of scents. Traders brought spices, resin, and perfumed oils to disguise the background stench. But even frankincense could not outmatch the smell of humanity packed close in the heat. Goats bleated in the alleys, their droppings mixed with mud until the ground became a living paste. Dogs picked through scraps of meat tossed from stalls, and flies gathered in black clouds so thick they seemed to hum. Yet the people of Mesopotamia accepted it as the natural price of civilization. To them, cleanliness was not about absence of dirt, but control over it, keeping it out of sight, beneath the ground or behind a wall. The invention of the sewer was not about removal, but concealment. Water itself was holy, unpredictable, and feared. The same floods that brought life could drown entire districts. washing through the streets and filling homes with a slurry of silt and excrement. When the waters receded, they left behind a layer of fine grey mud that cracked and reeked under the sun. The survivors rebuilt on top of it, sealing in the rot beneath new floors. Each generation rose a little higher than the last, their temples standing above the graves of old foundations. Civilization climbed skyward on pillars of its own refuse, confident that the gods looked down and saw only progress. At night, the heat softened and the city exhaled. The scent of burning bitumen drifted from the riverbanks, where fires boiled pitch for waterproofing boats and pipes. The smoke mingled with the damp breath of the drains, until the whole city smelled faintly of tar and rot. Families slept on rooftops to escape the closeness of their homes, listening to the quiet gurgle of the sewers below. Somewhere in the darkness, a priest sang to Enki, the god of wisdom and water, asking him to keep the rivers flowing clear. The request was eternal, and always unanswered. Still there was pride in their filth. They were no longer animals wandering through the wilderness. They had mastered the elements, or so they believed. Their cities glittered with copper, their streets lined with baked brick. The drains that ran beneath their feet were proof of sophistication, not decay. To have a sewer was to belong to the civilized world. The filth beneath was the cost of greatness, a problem properly buried. If the river ran brown, it was only because it carried away the proof of success. When drought came, the illusion faltered. The water that once swept the waste away slowed to a crawl. The stench thickened in the heat, hovering over the canals like a ghost. People prayed louder, sacrificed more, burned sweeter incense. But the smell did not care for prayers. It rose through the city, indifferent to temples and kings, reminding everyone that, for all their ingenuity, they still lived on the same earth as before, only now they had given it walls and called it home. In the end, Mesopotamia achieved what no wandering tribe ever had. It learned to live with its own pollution. The sewer became a symbol of progress, a mark of civilization's triumph over nature. But the rivers kept their colour, and the air kept its taste. They had buried the problem without solving it, and in doing so, invented one of humanity's oldest illusions. That filth, when hidden, ceases to exist. From these muddy cities, the idea of cleanliness spreads west, to the people who will perfect it in marble and mistake spectacle for sanitation, the Romans. Rome inherited the idea of drains and sewers from older worlds and turned them into monuments. Where the cities of Mesopotamia had hidden their waste beneath the ground, Rome put its mastery of water on proud display. The empire's identity was built on flow, fountains, aqueducts, and baths that poured day and night in an endless shimmer of movement. Water became the proof of civilization, a living symbol that the city had subdued nature and forced it into marble channels. Beneath that constant sound of trickling and rushing, another truth hummed quietly. The water was shared by everyone and everything. The same streams that cooled the rich filled the poor man's bucket, and what left the baths returned through the drains to the river, carrying the empire's perfume and disease together. The aqueducts were miracles of engineering and arrogance. They marched across hills and valleys, each arch a declaration that Rome could command the land itself. Fresh water from distant springs travelled miles through lead-lined conduits before cascading into fountains and cisterns. The people marvelled at its purity as it spilled from carved stone mouths, never thinking about what it gathered along the way. The water that filled the city's famous public baths had already passed through pipes coated in mineral crust and lead flakes. Still, the sound of it, the clear, steady fall, became the sound of civilization itself. Rome was a city that never slept dry. Bathing was not a private act, it was theatre. The thermae, those vast marble palaces of steam and sound, were where the empire came to wash, gossip, argue, and display its wealth. The baths of Caracalla and Diocletian could hold thousands, their pools reflecting columns, mosaics, and the pale blur of bodies moving through vapour. Attendants oiled the skin of senators, slaves, and merchants alike. The heat blurred all distinctions for a few hours each day. In the tepidarium, men discussed politics. In the frigidarium, they shivered into respectability. A Roman was expected to bathe daily, not necessarily to be clean, but to be seen being clean. Hygiene was no longer a necessity, but a performance of virtue and refinement. The water that entered these baths was fresh, but what left them was another matter. Once the pools had served their purpose, the runoff poured into the sewers, a vast underworld that the Romans considered their second triumph. The Cloaca Maxima, the great drain, ran like a buried river through the heart of the city. Builders boasted that it could swallow the Tiber itself. Citizens admired its permanence, its strength, its civilized darkness. But like all Roman marvels, it depended on scale, not sanitation. It carried human waste, animal blood from slaughterhouses, and runoff from the baths into the same river that fed their fountains. The Tiber glittered in the sun and stank in the heat. Rome's water cycle was perfect only in its circularity. What left one mouth entered another. The Roman obsession with odour was both practical and poetic. Perfumes and oils were rubbed into every limb, masking the scent of sweat and smoke that clung to a city of 1 million people. Markets overflowed with resins and myrrh, not for worship alone, but for survival. The wealthy filled their villas with bowls of rose petals and citrus peel. The poor relied on the baths where the mingled scents of oil, soapwort, and human breath created a fragrance uniquely Roman, sweet, heavy, and faintly rancid. The idea of dirt shifted again. To smell pleasant was to appear civilized, no matter the source of the water or the state of the drains. Cleanliness had become a matter of surface and scent, not purity. Public latrines turned necessity into spectacle. Long benches of polished stone, lined with evenly spaced holes, allowed dozens to relieve themselves side by side. The murmuring of conversation, punctuated by the drip of running water below. A communal sponge on a stick sat in a trough of vinegar for wiping. Shared by all, replaced rarely. Visitors from the provinces were shocked at first, then proud. Even waste in Rome had order. The sound of trickling beneath the seats was a reassurance. The empire flowed endlessly, even here. The act that once tied humanity to the earth had become part of the architecture of grandeur. Yet under the marble and mosaic, the same old truths persisted. The streets outside the baths were littered with refuse. The Tiber's edges festered with dead fish and discarded food. Diseases, dysentery, typhoid, parasites spread quietly through the crowded insula, where the poor hauled their water up rickety staircases and dumped their slops from the windows. For all their aqueducts and drains, most Romans still lived amid the same filth as their ancestors, only now it gleamed. Cleanliness was a privilege built atop someone else's dirt. The rich could afford fresh oil and daily baths. The poor made do with public fountains and faith in the goddess Cloacina, patron of the sewers. Even Rome's grandeur smelled of decay. In summer, when the heat rose from the paving stones, the city took on a haze, part dust, part steam, part invisible rot. The air shimmered with it. Vendors fanned their stalls to keep flies away. Bath attendants sprinkled herbs on the floors to cover the scent of mildew. Visitors wrote of the magnificence of the forum, the taste of the wine, the beauty of the aqueducts. They wrote less about the smell. It was everywhere and nowhere, the unspoken rhythm of a civilization that had learned to live with its own waste. As the empire expanded, so did its plumbing. Every conquered city was remade in Rome's image. Roads, baths, fountains, and drains. Water became the imperial language, the promise that wherever Rome went, order would follow. In Gaul, in Africa, in Britain, the same sound echoed through new-built streets, the splash of fountains, the murmur of drains, the rustle of shared water. To be Roman was to bathe, to perfume, to flow. It was a mark of belonging, even when it carried the same silent corruption beneath its marble skin. In time, that skin began to crack. The aqueducts required constant care, their arches repaired with the taxes of a restless empire. Lead pipes leaked, stones shifted, floods choked the sewers with silt. As the borders shrank and the treasury emptied, the baths grew quieter, the water slowed, the great public fountains ran dry, their basins filling with leaves and silence. When the barbarians came, they didn't need to destroy the aqueducts, neglected that for them. Without the steady hum of water, the illusion of cleanliness collapsed. The baths turned to ruins, the latrines to nests for birds. Rome, once the empire of shared water, sank back into the dust it had risen from. After the fountains of Rome fell silent, the early medieval period began, and the faith of Europe turned inward. Water, once a symbol of civilization, became a whisper of temptation. In the cold monasteries that dotted the darkening continent, the old aqueducts crumbled, and the habit of bathing with them. The Romans had worshipped cleanliness as a civic duty. Their heirs learned to distrust it as a sin. The empire of shared water gave way to the empire of the soul, where the body was no longer a temple, but a trial. The faithful sought purity through abstinence, and nothing was more suspect than pleasure, especially the warm comfort of a bath. The world outside the cloister was no cleaner. Fields ran with mud, streets with waste, and the rivers with both. The ruins of Roman pipes became nests for moss and frogs. In their place came wooden troughs and open ditches where the runoff of towns merged with the rain. The stench was constant, a mixture of tallow, dung, and the faint sweetness of decay. To the peasants who lived among it, filth was not a problem to be solved, but the background hum of existence. Cleanliness was for saints or lords, and neither could be trusted. For the poor, there was work to do and survival to think of, and water was for drinking, not indulgence. The church filled the void left by the baths, promising spiritual purity where physical comfort once ruled. To wash too often, priests warned, was to invite vanity and sin. The body was corrupt, a vessel of temptation that needed restraint, not care. Dirt became a badge of humility. Monks wore the same robes until they rotted, believing the smell of sweat and mildew to be proof of piety. Saints were described as sweet-smelling, not because they were clean, but because their holiness supposedly masked the odour of decay. The holier the man, the stronger the scent. The faithful believed that God could smell sincerity beneath the grime. In the monasteries where silence and repetition defined each day, hygiene was replaced by ritual. Instead of washing, monks scourged themselves, stripping away sin with lashes rather than soap. Their cells were cold and damp, their bodies cloaked in layers of wool that trapped the smell of prayer and skin. The air inside the cloisters was thick with candle smoke and human closeness. Lice thrived, crawling freely through tonsured hair and rough cloth. To remove them was to interrupt the divine order. After all, they too were God's creatures. The itch of devotion was a constant reminder of the body's weakness and the soul's endurance. In towns, the distinction between filth and faith blurred further. Streets became open sewers. Pigs rooted through refuse, eating what people dropped or dumped from their windows. The walls of houses soaked up the damp, and the air hung heavy with smoke from hearth fires that never quite went out. A passing rain might wash the surface clean for an hour or two, But beneath it all, the same rot persisted. The people prayed over their food, not for taste, but for safety. Bread might be baked with dust and ashes, ale might ferment with flies. They accepted it as part of life, unpleasant but ordained. Bathhouses still existed in some corners of Europe, especially in cities that remembered Rome's shadow, but they were viewed with suspicion. To enter one was to risk more than disease. It was to risk moral ruin. Public baths became associated with idleness, pleasure, and the whisper of sin. The few who sought them out were often branded as vain or worse. Priests preached that cleanliness distracted from devotion. Better to smell of work and sweat than to risk the softness of leisure. Even royalty followed the rule in their own way. Kings wore layers of linen and perfume, changing shirts instead of washing skin. The scent of sanctity had simply become more expensive. In the countryside, peasants waded barefoot through mud, spreading manure by hand and sleeping beside their animals. The same hands that milked cows, buried the dead, and ate bread never saw soap. When the weather turned warm, the smell thickened. Human, animal, and earth fused into one indistinguishable perfume. Children were born into it and died before ever leaving it, unaware that other ages had called such living unclean. To them, the air of home was the scent of life itself. When sickness came, the faithful turned to prayer, not cleanliness. Illness was the will of God, and only confession or pilgrimage could hope to cure it. Physicians, where they existed, relied on charms, herbs, and the movement of the stars. The idea that disease might rise from the dirt beneath their feet was unthinkable. Instead, they feared miasma, bad air, moral rot made visible. They burned incense and hung flowers in doorways, not to purify, but to appease. The stronger the smell of sanctity, the safer the soul. In that logic, plague found its truest ally. The church encouraged the belief that sickness was punishment, and dirt was merely a symptom of human frailty. To wash was to court pride, to think oneself above divine decree. A clean body meant a distracted mind. Only through filth could the soul remain properly grounded. To be clean in body was to be dirty in soul, and Europe took that lesson literally. Far to the east, where the winds sweep unhindered across the plains, life followed a different rhythm. The Mongols did not build walls to hold back the world. They lived inside it. To them, filth was not a mark of sin or shame. It was proof of endurance. The steppe was an endless ocean of grass and dust, and its people learned that survival came not from washing away the earth, but from blending with it. Theirs was a world without baths or drains, yet every dawn they rose clean in purpose, if not in skin. A Mongol's life was steeped in motion. The air smelled of ash and milk, leather and sweat. Smoke poured from the tops of yurts, staining the felt with black spirals that thickened over time until the roofs themselves seemed to breathe. Inside, the air was warm, close and dense, a mixture of burning dung, boiled meat, and unwashed bodies. Families huddled together around low fires, sharing bowls of fermented mare's milk that carried both sustenance and sourness in equal measure. The tang of it clung to their breath, their clothes, their skin. When they rode, the wind lifted it from them like incense, carrying the scent of the steppes wherever they went. They distrusted water, not because it was rare, but because it was alive. Rivers ran cold and fast, fed by mountains that shifted moods with the seasons. To submerge oneself in them was to tempt the spirits that dwelled there. Water was for drinking and for horses, not for vanity. To wash too often was to drain one's vitality, to let the world's energy slip away. Dirt, in contrast, sealed life in. It was armour, soft, invisible, and earned through effort. The Mongols believed that the clean smelled weak, and the weak were prey. On the steppe, a little grime was as essential as courage. Their bodies told the story of the land. Dust darkened their hair, sweat hardened their hands, and the sun carved their faces into permanence. Their clothes, thick felt, fur and leather, rarely left their backs. They slept in them, fought in them, buried their dead in them. The garments were softened with fat and smoke, treated by wear until they felt like skin. Lice and fleas thrived in the folds, but so did warmth, and warmth meant life. A clean man would freeze long before a filthy one would. The Mongols understood this intuitively and took pride in it. Comfort was for cities, survival was for the plains. Their horses carried the same scent of endurance. A herd of them could be smelled before it was seen, the musk of sweat, dung, and grass mixing into a thick animal perfume that lingered over the camp. The animals were not only transport but lifeblood, milk, meat, leather, and bone. The people drank their blood in emergencies and intimacy that blurred the line between man and beast. When they rode into battle, that smell of horseflesh and iron became their herald. Enemies who caught the wind downrange swore they could sense the Mongols approaching, an army of dust and sweat, as though the earth itself were riding to war. Their hygiene was not neglect, but adaptation. They cleaned their weapons and tools meticulously, oiled leather and scraped rust from steel, but their bodies remained part of the wilderness. Smoke served as their cleanser. It drove off insects, dried sweat, and masked decay. The yurts thick with its scent became sanctuaries of survival. When the wind blew, it carried the smell of hundreds of fires across the plains, a reminder that even in a land without cities, humanity was present, smouldering quietly against the horizon. To outsiders, they seemed barbaric. Traders from China and Persia wrote of their unwashed skins, their raw diet, their alien indifference to the comforts of the civilized world. But filth to the settled peoples was freedom to the nomads. The Mongols could pack their lives in an hour and vanish into the landscape, leaving nothing behind but ashes and hoofprints. Their simplicity made them unstoppable. Disease that ravaged city dwellers rarely slowed them down. Parasites that thrived in filth found no new host among people already teeming with them. The very dirt that others despised became the Mongols' shield. Their camps moved with the seasons. In summer, the air shimmered with heat, the ground powdered to dust that clung to every limb and nostril. In winter, the smoke from their fires thickened until it tasted like tar. The yurts leaked heat and history alike, every surface polished by breath and touch. Inside, the smell of milk curdled sweetly in the air, mixed with the iron tang of dried blood and the faint sourness of fermented butter. Visitors might gag. The Mongols inhaled it as the scent of home. Theirs was not a clean life, but it was honest. Every odour had a purpose, every layer of grime a story. When they went to war, the difference between them and their enemies was more than armour or language. It was philosophy. The Mongols believed in movement, in the open sky, in the refusal to be trapped by walls or drains. They could live for months without washing, sleep in their armour, eat what their horses could find, and still fight with precision and speed. Against them stood kingdoms, perfumed and perfumed again, soldiers softened by civility, commanders who feared discomfort as much as defeat. To the Mongols, their enemies smelled of weakness, of flowers, incense and decay. The fall of each city brought new scents to the wind. When they stormed the walls of Samarkand, the air filled with the aroma of burning cedar and bodies. Baghdad, once a jewel of scholars and gardens, became a river of ash and blood. The Mongols rode through its streets indifferent, their faces streaked with sweat and dust, their nostrils already accustomed to worse. They found the perfume jars and the silks of the caliphs absurd, trinkets of people who thought beauty could make them safe. The conquerors who had never known the softness of soap dismantled the empires built on it. Filth at last triumphed over refinement. Yet for all their ferocity, the Mongols were not careless. Their discipline was brutal but methodical. They buried waste away from camps, burned what they could, and let the wind carry the rest. Theirs was a logic of efficiency rather than cleanliness. When their empire spread across Asia and into Europe, it carried not only terror but resilience, a way of life immune to comfort's corruption. The scent of conquest was not of incense or glory but of leather, sweat and singed hair. They rode farther than anyone before them, their shadows stretching from China to Hungary, from Siberia to Persia. Wherever they went, they brought the smell of the steppe, that mixture of smoke, milk and iron that marked both their poverty and their power. To the conquered, it was the odour of apocalypse. To the Mongols themselves, it was the smell of victory. Their filth was not something to escape, it was something to wield. When the Mongols' dust finally settled, Europe's cities began to rise again, brick by brick, corpse by corpse. The same trade routes that carried silk and silver now carried fleas and fever. By the 14th century, Europe was alive once more, but its revival smelled of rot. The towns that sprouted across the continent were born of ambition and ignorance. Narrow alleys coiled like veins through huddled houses, their walls leaning so close that neighbours could shake hands from the upper windows. Beneath the ground was a patchwork of straw, refuse and dung, beaten flat by 1,000 unwashed feet. Pigs rooted openly in the streets, eating what people threw away, and people threw away everything. Waste from kitchens, workshops, and chamber pots was poured from doorways and left to mingle in a slurry that trickled toward the nearest gutter. When it rained, the streets became shallow rivers of brown, carrying the memory of every meal down to the town ditch or the nearest stream. The water there glistened, oily and alive, its surface rippling with the movement of rats. Rivers and wells that once promised life now delivered death in slow doses. The same current that turned mill wheels and washed wool also carried human waste. Fishermen set their nets downstream from tanneries, their catch tasting faintly of lye and filth. The air over the cities was never still. It trembled with the hum of flies, the crackle of fires, and the low, wet hiss of decay. The smell was overwhelming at first to visitors from the countryside, but to those born within the walls, it became the smell of home. Children grew up breathing it as naturally as air itself. As the population swelled, so did the hazards of proximity. Every craftsman's trade produced its own signature stench, the acrid smoke of blacksmiths' forges, the sour rot of butchers' yards, the biting fumes of tanners boiling hides in urine and quicklime. Dye makers stirred vats of pigment thickened with blood, while brewers dumped spent grain that fermented in the sun. The mingled result was a fog of life and death intertwined. The wealthy tried to rise above it by moving their homes uphill or hanging fragrant herbs in their windows, but the air ignored such boundaries. It crept upward through every crack and chimney until the entire city breathed as one diseased lung. Doctors, such as they were, wandered these streets wrapped in heavy robes and the sharp reek of vinegar. They spoke of miasma, bad air, that seeped from the soil and the sick. Their solution was scent. Streets were smoked with herbs, homes perfumed with rosemary, lavender, and burning pitch. When plague came, they filled their bird-beaked masks with spices and flowers, believing the sweet smell would guard their lungs against death. They were not entirely wrong. The air did kill, but not because it was wicked. It carried the invisible riders that thrived on rats, and the rats thrived on waste. The connection between the two was too simple to be seen. When the Black Death arrived, the cities were ready for it in all the worst ways. Filth had woven itself into the fabric of life, so tightly that no one could imagine existence without it. The first signs were small, a few swollen lumps a few unexplained deaths. Then the smell changed. People spoke of a new odour, thicker, heavier, as though the air itself had begun to spoil. In the summer heat, corpses piled faster than they could be buried. Churchyards overflowed, graves were dug shallow, sometimes shared between strangers. The living fled to the countryside, carrying the disease with them, and returned months later to find their homes filled with silence and weeds. The survivors adapted as they always did. They blamed the stars, the foreigners, the air, or God, never the streets beneath their feet. When the plague subsided, they returned to their routines, patching roofs, sweeping thresholds, tossing their waste into the same gutters. What had once been shocking became familiar. The stench of rot became the smell of survival, a reassurance that life, however foul, continued. Mothers rocked infants to sleep beside drains that murmured with sewage. Bakers opened their ovens beside tanneries. The line between living and dying blurred into odour. To mask their fear, people filled the world with sound and colour. Church bells tolled constantly, not just for the dead, but to ward off the bad air. Processions marched through the streets, swinging censers heavy with incense, hoping to drown out the invisible corruption with smoke. Markets returned. Festivals resumed, and the air once again filled with the laughter of the doomed. It was easier to believe that filth was inevitable than to imagine changing it. The rich built taller houses, hanging flowers from their balconies to perfume the breeze. The poor continued to live beside their refuse, sharing their rooms with vermin. Between the two classes, the wind carried no prejudice. Rats became the true citizens of these cities. They ruled the alleys and granaries, their bodies soft with the harvest of human excess. By night, they moved through kitchens and cellars, fat on the crumbs of bread and decay. The people barely noticed them anymore. Their scratching was part of the lullaby of city life. Even the cats meant to keep them at bay were too thin and few to matter. When the plague returned, as it often did, the rats were already waiting. The cycle of filth and fever became as predictable as the seasons. For those who lived through repeated outbreaks, the stench of the city grew strangely comforting. It was familiar, a background rhythm that proved life went on. When the air smelled too clean, after rain or in winter frost, people grew uneasy. The silence of purity felt alien. In taverns, they joked that the bad air kept them strong, that it built resistance. They were not entirely wrong. The weakest had already died. In this new world, the survivors were those who had made peace with the smell of decay. Slowly, though, doubt crept in. The church's prayers no longer guaranteed safety, and the plague's pattern began to trouble even the most devout. People started to notice that the cleanest homes, those swept and aired, fared slightly better. The physicians' theories of bad air began to merge with instinct. Perhaps filth was not just a fact of life, but a danger in itself. The idea took centuries to mature, but it began here in the exhausted cities that had lost too much to ignorance. The same men who once filled their beaked masks with flowers now began to notice the sewers, the rats, the drains. They had no word for sanitation yet, only a growing sense that something about the dirt was wrong. After generations of plague, people began to fear dirt again, though they didn't yet understand it. By the time England reached the Tudor age, the lesson of the plague had hardened into paradox. People feared filth, but refused to part with it. Water was still distrusted, soap was rare, and cleanliness became a matter of illusion, a performance of virtue, not a practice of hygiene. The streets of London filled again with wealth, trade, and sickness in equal measure. The air above the city shimmered with coal smoke and perfume, the twin fragrances of progress and denial. Beneath the bells of St. Paul's, the gutters ran black. The sweet stink of civilization had returned, more refined than ever, and no one wanted to look too closely at its source. London was swelling, its river lined with wharves and houses that leaned toward one another like gossiping old women. The Thames, once a highway of trade and life, had become a liquid dustbin. Every morning, servants emptied chamber pots directly into the current, joining the outflow of tanneries, breweries, and slaughterhouses. At low tide, the river exposed its secrets, layers of mud, entrails, and rotting vegetables glistening in the sun. Children played beside it. Laundresses beat their linens against its edge. The smell was unholy, but the city depended on it. For all its rot, the Thames was still the source of drinking water, faith, and poetry. Shakespeare called it silver, though he must have known better. The nobles who ruled from their country estates prided themselves on refinement, but refinement stopped at the skin. Bathing was still considered dangerous, an indulgence that could open the pores to sickness. Instead, they cleansed themselves with linen. To change one's shirt was to wash one's soul. The wealthier the man, the more layers he wore. Fine linen closest to the body, coarser fabric above, velvet and brocade on top. Dirt was hidden under thread and rank, disguised as luxury. The smell of sweat trapped in those layers was softened with perfume, rosewater, musk and ambergris. These scents became symbols of virtue, masking the truth beneath the lace. At court, cleanliness was a kind of theatre. Courtiers powdered their faces with lead, their hair with flour, and their bodies with talc and lavender. Women painted their cheeks red with mercury and coated their lips in mixtures of vinegar and crushed insects. The result was dazzling from a distance, grotesque up close. Faces cracked like porcelain masks, and skin beneath the paint blistered and peeled. Yet no one dared appear barefaced. The powdered corpse look was the new ideal, death disguised as beauty. To smell faintly of rot was no embarrassment. It was fashion. Servants bore the worst of it. Their days began before dawn, sweeping ashes from the fireplaces, hauling buckets from the privies, and carrying waste through narrow corridors to dump in the street. In the great houses, they were invisible, ghost-like figures who existed to absorb the filth of others. Their hands were perpetually chapped, their nails rimmed with soot. The perfume that floated through the upper halls came at the cost of their backs and lungs. The richer their masters became, the dirtier the work that kept their homes presentable. In the city, the same hierarchy played out on a grander scale. The wealthy lived above the filth, literally, in upper stories with windows that opened onto air instead of alleyways. Below them, the poor lived at ground level, close to the waste that never stopped flowing. Fishmongers' stalls left piles of scales to fester in the heat, and butchers threw animal heads into the gutters. In the summer, London became an oven of stench, so thick that travellers complained the smell of the city reached them miles before the gates. But within the walls, people no longer noticed. The air they breathed was the air of home. Even religion carried the perfume of contradiction. Churches filled with incense so thick it blurred the light of candles. Worshippers knelt amid the mingled scent of wax, sweat, and old stone, convinced that sweetness in the air could cleanse sin from the soul. The same hands that crossed themselves in prayer wiped noses and touched door latches smeared with grime. The holy and the filthy lived side by side, indistinguishable. The plague still flared in corners of the city, but the people had grown used to its rhythm, a seasonal evil as ordinary as rain. Medicine offered little refuge. Physicians prescribed vinegar washes, bleeding, and herbs to balance the humours. Barbers doubled as surgeons, rinsing their razors in dirty basins between patients. People still spoke of bad air, but now they believed they could outsmart it with scent. Street sellers hawked pomanders, small silver balls filled with spices, and gentlemen held them to their noses when they passed through crowded markets, Ladies wore perfumed gloves to mask the odour of the court. The air became a battleground between stench and sweetness never quite won. Inside homes, the contradiction deepened. The same rooms that hosted feasts and dances also held the night's refuse. Chamber pots were emptied into the courtyard each morning, splashing across cobblestones that never dried. Rats rustled behind panelling, living off crumbs from banquets. When night fell, the candles dimmed, and the sweet smell of wax melted into the darker scent of human presence. Breath, sweat, damp clothes, and hidden rot. Yet to the Tudor mind, this was not filth but life itself. A home was not expected to be clean, it was expected to be alive. The obsession with appearances extended to language itself. Clean became a word for morality, not hygiene. A clean conscience mattered more than a clean floor. Sermons praised purity of thought while the congregation sat in air that smelled of tallow and smoke. The poor, unable to disguise their scent with perfume, were accused of moral weakness. The rich, drenched in musk, declared themselves virtuous by fragrance alone. Dirt had become an index of class, invisible on the powerful, obvious on the rest. London's expansion made this hypocrisy impossible to ignore. The population surged, pressing more people into tighter quarters. The sound of cartwheels sloshing through muck became the city's heartbeat. Nightmen were hired to empty cesspits under cover of darkness, their work hidden but essential. They waded waist-deep in waste, hauling buckets through the sleeping streets, while the rest of London dreamed beneath quilts scented with lavender. These men lived on the edge of respectability, feared for their trade but relied upon to keep the illusion intact. By morning, the city smelled almost tolerable again, until it didn't. And yet, despite the rot, London glittered. The theatres thrived. The river carried barges filled with silks and spices. Music echoed through gardens and courtyards. The city's energy was infectious, its vitality drawn from the same filth that sustained it. Cleanliness was not progress but performance, a fragile layer of powder over centuries of decay. The English had learned to disguise the stench, to turn odour into ornament, to hide disease behind ceremony and laughter. They called it civility. By the end of the Tudor era, the scent of roses and rot had become inseparable. To smell of life was to smell of both. The perfume of civilization had masked the plague, but never erased it. London's people no longer feared dirt. They wore it elegantly, powdered and perfumed, confident that no one could tell the difference. Beneath the lace, the same old earth pressed close against the skin, patient and undefeated. The English had learned to hide their filth beneath manners, music, and ceremony, mistaking the performance for progress. About a century later, across the Channel, France will take this deception to its highest and most fragrant form. Versailles glittered like a dream made of mirrors. From a distance, it was the image of perfection, a palace of light balanced delicately on the edge of a swamp. Every stone gleamed, every corridor shone. But step inside, and the illusion began to sweat. Beneath the chandeliers and gold leaf, the air was heavy, a sweet, sour blend of rose oil, candle smoke, and something unmistakably human. It was not the smell of decay exactly, but of denial, the scent of thousands of bodies performing purity inside a place that could never be clean. The Tudor world had perfumed its poverty. The French court perfected the art of pretending filth did not exist at all. The Sun King ruled a realm that worshipped appearances. Versailles was not just his palace, it was the stage on which his divinity was rehearsed each day. Courtiers rose before dawn to attend the royal dressing, where perfume and powder replaced water and soap. Bathing was still considered a dangerous indulgence, a thing that could open the pores and invite illness. Instead, Attendants washed the king's hands with scented alcohol and wiped his face with fine linen. The fragrance of his person was calculated. Musk, ambergris, and orange blossom, an olfactory crown to match his golden one. To serve near him was to smell like him, or to disappear. The rest of the palace followed his example. Versailles overflowed with scents, layer upon layer, lavender sachets, pomanders, perfumed gloves, and walls hung with fresh flowers. Perfume was sprayed onto furniture, poured into fountains, and even dripped into candles so that the air itself might seem pure. Water, by contrast, was treated with suspicion. The nearby ponds were stagnant and green, their surfaces veiled with scum. The fountains, famous for their beauty, recycled the same murky water over and over again. What trickled through marble nymphs' hands was as foul as any city drain, but no one mentioned it. The point was not cleanliness, but the appearance of abundance. Behind the draperies, the truth seeped through. The palace had no proper drains, and the courtiers had nowhere to go. They relieved themselves where they stood, behind curtains, under staircases, into the corners of galleries. Servants followed discreetly with buckets and cloths, but they could not keep pace with the scale of need. In the summer, the smell thickened until it clung to the velvet hangings. Guests complained that the air in the Hall of Mirrors shimmered with more than light. Yet still they bowed, still they praised, still they called it paradise. The rats came too, uninvited but inevitable. They nested in the walls and feasted in the kitchens, slipping through corridors at night to dine beneath the chandeliers. They gnawed at the gilt legs of furniture, dragged crumbs from the king's table into the shadows, and multiplied among the perfumes and silks. The courtiers pretended not to see. They stepped daintily over droppings on their way to balls and found poetic ways to describe the rustle in the dark. Elegance demanded blindness. In Versailles, the only thing worse than filth was acknowledging it. The gardens outside were no better. Louis XIV had built them as a monument to control. Nature trimmed into obedience, water commanded into shape. But the same canals that fed the fountains also collected sewage from the palace. The air that drifted across the manicured lawns carried the faint sweetness of rot. Visitors were instructed to breathe shallowly and admire the symmetry. The beauty of Versailles was always meant to be seen, not smelled. Inside, the illusion of refinement reached fever pitch. Courtiers bathed themselves in clouds of powder, leaving white handprints on every surface they touched. The women's wigs towered high enough to hide nests of insects. Some even kept small cages of perfume-soaked cotton to mask the odour. Men painted their faces as carefully as their swords were polished, their skin cracking beneath layers of lead and starch. At night, the air in the salons grew thick, the heat of candles and bodies turning perfume to vapour. The guests fanned themselves with lace, laughing through waves of artificial sweetness until they could no longer tell where scent ended and sickness began. To be fragrant was to be virtuous, and virtue was a form of camouflage. Poverty reeked of tallow, sweat, and bread. Refinement, by contrast, smelled of roses and rot. Perfume became a social currency. The stronger, the more respectable. Merchants grew rich selling bottled illusions to a court terrified of its own humanity. Every whiff of musk was a denial of mortality. Every drop of jasmine an attempt to rise above the flesh. The more the palace stank, the more perfume it demanded, an arms race against reality. The irony was that Versailles, for all its excess, was built on the same fragile infrastructure as any medieval town. The drains leaked, the wells soured. Servants carried water in buckets from distant springs, sloshing it through corridors already damp with spills. When the pipes froze in winter, the air filled with the smell of smoke and unwashed wool. During feasts, thousands crowded into rooms meant for hundreds, sweating through satin while the musicians played on. The scent of the court was a living thing, fed daily by fear, vanity, and the steady decay of everything gilded. Visitors often wrote of the smell, though few dared to say it plainly. Some described it as overwhelming richness, others as the essence of life. The truth was more literal. Versailles smelled like people, too many of them pressed too close, pretending too hard. The very air seemed tired from the effort of civility, yet to breathe that air was to belong. The courtiers had trained their senses to interpret stench as splendour, to equate perfume with power, to mistake exhaustion for grace. When the king walked through the hall of mirrors, the courtiers parted like petals, bowing low as the light refracted across their powdered faces. Beneath the mirrors lay stains no one mentioned. Versailles was a cathedral built to house the denial of decay, and every candle lit within it burned against the truth that all beauty fades into smell. By the end of the 17th century, the perfume that once symbolized divine order had become its own religion. The courtiers worshipped scent as the last defense against reality, each new fragrance an act of faith. They no longer remembered that perfume was meant to mask something. They believed it was purity. The illusion had become complete and irreversible. Elegance had become a kind of amnesia, a deliberate forgetting of everything beneath the surface. Versailles was not a palace of cleanliness, but of collective denial, a monument to the human talent for ignoring what cannot be erased. Beneath the powdered faces and painted ceilings, the air thickened, sweet and rancid, like the breath of history itself. But as France bathes in powder and perfume, others are boarding ships, spreading their own stench to every corner of the world. The age of exploration promised discovery, empire and glory, but its first true export was filth. The courtiers of France masked their rot with roses. The sailors of Spain and Portugal carried it in barrels and bilge water. Their vessels were floating worlds, sealed boxes of wood and sweat, where decay was both passenger and crew. They sailed with banners of faith and ambition, never realizing that their greatest cargo was invisible, and it never stopped multiplying. Life aboard a ship was a study in endurance. The decks gleamed in sunlight, but below the air was thick and black. The hold smelled of salt, pitch and rot, a stew of damp timber, tar and humanity. Men slept in hammocks, hung inches apart, their sweat soaking through the ropes and dripping onto those below. Lice crawled through their hair, rats nested in the grain, and the bilge water at the bottom of the ship never stilled. It was a dark soup of oil, vomit and seawater that rose and fell with the waves, splashing against the hull in a slow rhythm that matched the sailors' breathing. The smell was constant, sour, metallic and warm. It clung to the skin long after landfall, a reminder that civilization had found a way to rot on the move. Food, when it lasted, was another ordeal. Salted meat reeked of brine and decay, biscuits crumbled with the crunch of weevils, and the drinking water turned green within weeks. The sailors drank it anyway, choking down the taste of mould because thirst was worse. Those with rank received wine or beer, though both soured quickly in the heat. When the barrels ran dry, they drank whatever rain they could catch. Their faces lifted to the sky like men in prayer. The seas connected continents, but the water they travelled on was never clean. Disease thrived in this closed world. Scurvy, dysentery, and fevers spread faster than the wind. The smell of sickness became part of the ship itself, a sweet, cloying odour that mixed with salt and smoke, until no one could tell where the rot ended and the living began. The physicians, if one sailed aboard, had little to offer. They carried jars of vinegar, leeches, and good intentions. When a man's gums bled or his limbs blackened, there was nothing to do but wrap him in sailcloth and drop him overboard. The ocean became the world's first shared graveyard, filled with the forgotten evidence of human ambition. And yet, this was called progress. The explorers believed they were carrying civilization outward. Faith, science, order, but they brought with them the same habits that had poisoned their cities. They dumped waste into the sea, tossed carcasses overboard, and lived shoulder to shoulder in filth. The rats followed faithfully, scampering down mooring ropes when ships docked in new lands. They were the quiet conquerors of empire, spreading fleas and fever faster than any flag. The age of discovery was also the age of contagion. When the ships reached the Americas, the real exchange began. The sailors stepped ashore carrying not just guns and goods, but microbes their bodies had stopped noticing. They breathed, and entire civilizations sickened. Smallpox, influenza, typhus, invisible armies marching ahead of them. Within decades, millions were gone. The conquerors saw it as divine favor, proof of their destiny, never realizing they were agents of their own decay. The tropical ports where ships anchored became laboratories of disease. The air shimmered with heat and rot. Mosquitoes bred in barrels, rats in the warehouses. The harbours of Havana, Goa, and Manila smelled alike, a blend of salt, sweat, spices, and sewage. The same perfumes and powders that masked decay in Versailles now mixed with the stench of palm oil, tobacco, and rum. Civilization had gone global, and so had its refuse. Merchants bragged of wealth while stepping over dead fish and rotting cargo. The world was being connected not by culture, but by contamination. Europe's pride in its maritime empire rested on its ships, but those ships were floating epidemics. Slaves packed into the holds of galleons lay chained in darkness, the air around them turning black with heat and breath. The stink of the Middle Passage was said to be smelled miles before a ship reached port. Sweat, blood, excrement, fear, all fermented in the dark and clung to every plank. When the hatches opened, the crew staggered back, their own nostrils overwhelmed. Yet even this horror was written into the ledgers as commerce, sanitized by distance. The same ports that received silver and sugar received plague. The cost of progress was counted in bodies, not coins. Every voyage carried fragments of filth from one shore to another. Fleas from the steppe reached the Americas. Shipworms from the Caribbean chewed through the hulls of Dutch traders. Even the air changed as ships brought new plants, animals, and insects across the oceans. Mosquitoes found new continents. Rats became global citizens. The same pest that had gnawed through Rome's sewers and London's docks now gnawed through the corners of temples and huts a world away. Mankind had finally achieved what it always dreamed of: connection, but connection came with contagion. The sailors themselves grew used to it. Their noses dulled, their bodies toughened, their souls hardened. The smell of death became routine. They joked over the corpses tossed to the sea, swapped lice as carelessly as stories, and spat into the same water they prayed for wind from. To live at sea was to abandon the idea of cleanliness entirely. When they reached land, they carried the same habits ashore, founding colonies built on waste. Towns sprang up beside rivers already fouled, ports filled with garbage and promise alike. The pattern of civilization repeated itself, only now on a global scale. The myths of purity that had comforted Versailles dissolved in the brine. Out here, there was no perfume strong enough to hide the truth. The ocean smelled of everything humanity had ever been: sweat, smoke, blood, and decay. The explorers called it freedom. The conquered called it disease. Between them stretched the same unbroken current of corruption that linked every age before and after. The world had finally been made one, bound together not by ideals but by contamination. By the 18th century, maps had grown crowded with borders and trade routes, but all the lines pointed back to the same truth. Wherever humanity went, its smell followed. Every discovery brought new pollution. Every empire spread new plague. The globe had become one vast circulating sewer, dressed up as progress. The explorers had crossed the last frontier, only to find themselves surrounded by their own reflection. The same filth in every port, the same rot under every flag. The world was connected at last by filth. By the time the 19th century arrived, humanity had convinced itself that it had finally tamed the stench of history. The age of exploration had scattered its filth across the world, but Victorian London promised something new: order, sanitation, and the clean conscience of empire. Soap had become salvation, plumbing a moral victory, and coal a symbol of progress. The city was vast, ingenious, and sick. To the Victorians, filth was no longer a fact of life, but a personal failing, something to be hidden, punished, or preached against. Cleanliness had ceased to be practical. It was now spiritual. The empire washed its hands with scented soap, then went on poisoning its rivers. London was the grandest city on earth, and one of the most unlivable. Its streets gleamed with gaslight, yet its air was nearly solid. Coal dust coated every surface, windows, lungs, teeth. The fog that rolled through the streets was yellow-brown and tasted of ash, thick enough to swallow whole buildings. Street lamps glowed dimly through the haze like dying candles, and the people coughed themselves, horse-walking beneath them. The Industrial Revolution had turned the city into a furnace. The sun itself seemed reluctant to rise over the smoke. In this new world, dirt was both enemy and necessity, the fuel of civilization and the thing that civilization pretended to have conquered. The Victorians attacked filth with ritual precision. Soap advertisements promised not just cleanliness, but virtue. To wash one's hands was to cleanse the soul. Pears, sunlight, and carbolic became brands of moral purity, their posters showing women and children radiant with lather, as if decency itself could be bought by the bar. The upper classes filled their homes with porcelain basins and perfumed soaps, their tubs rimmed with gold leaf and good intentions. Water still came from the same polluted Thames that had carried centuries of waste, but now it was piped through brass and marble, making the illusion complete. For the first time, filth was out of sight, and therefore, in the Victorian mind, gone. Beneath this gleaming surface lay a labyrinth of new ambition, the sewers. Designed by men who understood that civilization's heartbeat ran underground, they were vast tunnels of brick and darkness, carrying the city's sins away with clockwork regularity. Joseph Bazalgette's grand engineering projects were hailed as proof that modernity could banish the smell of history. In truth, they only organised it. The waste of millions flowed neatly into the Thames, joining industrial runoff and animal remains in a slow, poisonous tide. When the summer heat rose, the river turned thick and brown, steaming beneath Westminster Bridge. The smell was so overpowering that Parliament itself fled its chambers, stuffing curtains with lime-soaked sheets to block the odour. The newspapers called it the Great Stink. Civilization, it seemed, had found a way to perfume its decay, until the wind changed. Above ground, the people congratulated themselves. They built monuments to hygiene and morality, public baths, washhouses, and hospitals lined with white tile. Soap and salvation were linked in every sermon. Cleanliness next to godliness, carved into the heart of the new industrial faith. The rich bathed in hot water scented with lavender. The poor queued for their turn at communal taps that trickled with chill brown liquid. Poverty itself began to smell suspicious. The scent of sweat or soot was taken as proof of moral weakness. Those who could afford it drowned their bodies in perfume and starch, while those who could not were branded unfit. Not just unclean, but undeserving. The contradiction was everywhere. The city's fog, thick with coal smoke and factory fumes, was a constant reminder that cleanliness was an illusion. Soot fell like black snow, coating laundry, hung to dry, settling on food, seeping into every pore. Women carried handkerchiefs, soaked in scent to their noses. Men smoked cigars to disguise the air they breathed. Doctors warned of miasma rising from the drains, even as they praised the cleanliness of gaslit hospitals. The illusion of purity was maintained through sheer will and through endless scrubbing. The Victorians cleaned constantly, polishing the brass of an empire corroding beneath its own progress. The Thames remained the city's mirror, reflecting both grandeur and guilt. Engineers measured its tides, but no one dared measure its contents. Barges carried refuse downstream, by the ton, dumping it just far enough away to maintain plausible ignorance. The river that had once been London's lifeline was now its bloodstream, thick with the residue of civilization. The people walking its bridges no longer turned away. They simply stopped smelling. The stink of industry became the scent of patriotism. Smoke meant work, soot meant pride, and progress meant never asking what was being burned to fuel it. Inside the grand homes of the rising middle class, cleanliness turned domestic. Servants scrubbed the floors with carbolic acid and polished the silver until it gleamed like judgment. Families prided themselves on spotless tablecloths and white curtains, symbols of moral superiority. Women became the guardians of purity, their virtue measured by the brightness of their linens. Dirt was sin, dust was shame. Yet the very products they used to fight grime were made in factories that blackened the air and poisoned the water. Each bar of soap washed one conscience clean and one river darker. Even the poor learned to pretend. The labourers who trudged through the mud of Southwark and Whitechapel scraped their boots before entering the pubs that stank of beer and despair. They could not afford the new morality of soap, so they cultivated endurance instead. The air in the tenements was dense with smoke, sweat and sewage. Whole families shared single rooms. The walls wept moisture. The floors rotted. Children played beside open drains, their laughter echoing off walls that glistened faintly with damp. The reformers called it moral decay, but it was simply the smell of survival. For the upper classes, the scent of London's poor became an abstract evil, a thing to be discussed in pamphlets and avoided in person. Charities distributed soap and tracts in equal measure, certain that vice could be scrubbed away with the right combination of chlorine and prayer. The city's newspapers celebrated progress with the same breathless optimism once reserved for conquest. Every new sewer, every paved street, every chimney stack was another victory over nature. Yet in their triumph, the Victorians had only traded visible dirt for invisible poison. The soot that drifted down on their breakfast tables was the residue of empire, and they swallowed it proudly. As the century wore on, the cult of cleanliness deepened. Laundries multiplied, advertisements promised purity in powder form, and colognes declared moral refinement in every drop. Londoners no longer feared the smell of filth, they feared the appearance of it. Cleanliness became costume, virtue became vapour, and morality could be purchased wholesale. A spotless home, a shining boot, a whiff of rosewater. These were the new badges of respectability. Behind the polished brass and lace curtains, the same decay crept quietly on. The city had not been purified, it had been disguised. By the end of the century, London stood as the symbol of a world convinced it had conquered dirt. Its streets were paved, its sewers mapped, its people perfumed. Yet the river still reeked, the factories still smoked, and the air still carried the faint tang of coal and cholera. The Victorians had achieved what every civilization before them had only dreamed of: the ability to bury their filth so deeply they could forget it existed. They mistook ignorance for cleanliness, concealment for progress, and perfume for purity. From the first fires in darkened caves to the coal smoke of Victorian dawns, humanity's story has been one long attempt to rise above its own scent. Each generation buried its dirt a little deeper, mistaking concealment for cleansing, mistaking habit for virtue. History is not a march toward cleanliness. It is the layering of waste under new definitions of decency. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.